The Galactic Conclave chamber was built to make everyone feel small. That was the point of it. The ceiling climbed so high that the top of it disappeared into shadow, and the curved tiers of seats wrapped around the central floor like the inside of something very old and very certain of itself. 31 species sat in those tiers. Some of them had been crossing between stars for 10,000 years before humans figured out fire. Some of them had names that no human mouth had successfully pronounced. All of them had long ago agreed, without much debate, that the universe was a place they understood. The human delegation sat in the lowest tier. 3 chairs. 3 humans. Nora Callahan. Jake Mercer. Cole Adkins. Nora set her mug on the railing in front of her. It was ceramic, white once, now the color of old paper. The words "Earth's Best" were printed on the side in letters that had faded so much you had to already know what they said to read them. She wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth sit in her palms. 2 tiers up, the Vorkai delegate looked at the mug. The look lasted half a second. It was the kind of look you give a drawing a child has taped to a door. Politely. Without really seeing it. Nora saw the look. She stirred her coffee. The session had not started yet. The chamber filled with the sounds of 31 species waiting, clicking, humming, breathing in rhythms that did not match human breathing. Jake sat with his hands loose on his knees, looking at the ceiling. Cole sat to Nora's left with his arms folded and his face still in the way that did not mean calm. It meant he had already run through every possible version of this day and chosen which ones he could accept. The Drenethi delegate leaned toward its colleague and said something in a low voice. It was not meant to carry. It did. The biological experiment that kept going. That was what it called humanity. Not with cruelty. Not with anger. With the flat, easy dismissal you use for things that do not require more than a passing thought. Jake did not react. Cole did not react. Nora took a slow sip of her coffee and said nothing at all. Then Vrethka entered the chamber. The sound of it was the first thing. 7 limbs, each one moving with precise control, and the sound they made on the stone floor was like something expensive being placed down carefully. The chamber did not decide to pay attention. It simply did. Every species in every tier tracked the movement the way you track something at the edge of your vision that you cannot name but cannot ignore. Vrethka was the hero of the siege of Karithven. The records said this. What the records did not carry was the weight of it, the particular way ancient things move when they have done something the rest of the universe said was not possible. Vrethka had held a dying star in stable orbit for 9 hours using relay physics that 20 research teams had written papers explaining could not work. The star had not agreed. Neither had Vrethka. 7 limbs settled into the Karithi delegation seat. Middle tier. Not the highest. The Karithi were old and respected and had never been the loudest voice in any room. Vrethka sat, and the chamber rearranged its attention the way a room rearranges itself when someone unexpected walks through the door and the air changes. The session chair opened the floor. Vrethka requested it before anyone else could speak. Emergency hearings were rare. Emergency hearings called by a decorated war hero of a senior species were essentially unheard of in 6,000 years of conclave records. The session chair granted the floor. Some things are too heavy to push back on. Vrethka did not begin with testimony. Instead, Vrethka asked a question. How many of you, Vrethka said, in the shared trade language all 31 species used, have stood next to a human when the human believed there was nothing left to lose? Silence. The kind of silence a room makes when it does not know whether the question is rhetorical. The Vorkai delegate, old, senior, carrying the easy confidence of a species that had not been surprised in a long time, made a sound. Thin. Polite. The sound of someone who has already decided a meeting is beneath them but is too well-bred to say so openly. Vrethka looked at the Vorkai delegate. The sound stopped. I am not here to praise them, Vrethka said. They did not ask me to come. I am here because this chamber has been making decisions about humanity based on what it believes humanity to be. A pause. One clean beat. What this chamber believes is wrong. The Farathi delegate, a young species, only 9 years in the conclave, shifted in its seat. The Drenethi delegate made a note. The Vorkai delegate went very still. In the lowest tier, Nora had stopped stirring her coffee. She held the mug in both hands and looked at the Karithi war hero standing in the center of the chamber floor. Jake had gone the particular kind of still that he went before things changed. Cole's hand moved to his left breast pocket, touched something through the fabric for a moment, then dropped back to his knee. None of them spoke. Vrethka scanned the chamber. 6,000 years the conclave had existed. It had watched species rise and burn and go quiet in the way species go quiet when they have run out of time or run out of reasons to keep going. It had built, across those millennia, a complete and working picture of what kinds of things deserved fear and what kinds of things deserved mild, benevolent interest from a safe and comfortable distance. Humans were filed under the second category. Charming. Soft-bodied. Biologically limited in ways that filled several chapters of galactic xenobiology textbooks. 1 brain. 2 primary limbs. Unable to survive open space without extensive machinery wrapped around them at all times. Required unconsciousness for a third of every day just to keep functioning. They had been in space for 60 years. 60. The Drenethi had been crossing star systems for 11,000 years. The Vorkai had been running wars longer than human civilization had been writing things down. And yet, Vrethka had called an emergency session. I will begin with a war, Vrethka said. 12 years ago. You have the records, sealed, but accessible to senior members of this chamber. I was there. I watched from the Karithi command post on the third day. A pause. Not dramatic. Just the space a true thing needs before it is said. I watched 11 human ships land on a burning colony while 400 Vorkai warships held position in orbit above it. The Vorkai delegate's stillness became a different kind of stillness. A human soldier stepped off the first transport, Vrethka continued. He looked at the burning buildings. He looked at the fleet above him. He said something to the soldier beside him. I was too far away to hear it. Vrethka stopped. The other soldier laughed. This man did not. He looked at the fleet one more time. Then he walked toward the fire. The chamber held that. That is where I will start. In the lowest tier, Jake was looking at the floor now. Not the chamber. Not Vrethka. Just a square meter of polished stone that he appeared to find very interesting. Nora noticed. She said nothing. She picked up her mug and drank her coffee and waited for what she already knew was coming. Cole touched his pocket again. The chamber waited. The mug said, Earth's best, in letters that had almost disappeared. The war happened 12 years ago, and Vrethka had been young then, young by Karithi standards, which meant a few centuries, which meant plenty old enough to know what a losing situation looked like. The Vorkai-Karithi conflict had 17 official names depending on which species was filing the paperwork. The Conclave's records called it the Thresh System Resource Dispute. The Karithi called it the burning of 17 homes. The Vorkai called it contested spatial reclamation, which was the kind of phrase that meant exactly what it sounded like if you read it carefully, and meant absolutely nothing at all if you preferred not to. 17 Karithi colonies. 4 years. The Conclave issued 3 formal statements of concern. The Vorkai filed counterstatements. The colonies kept burning. When the Karithi formally requested human military support, the response from the broader galactic community was not quite laughter. It was more polite than laughter. It was the gentle, measured amusement of a room full of adults watching a small child volunteer to carry something very heavy. Humans had been in space for 60 years. Their ships were sturdy in the way basic things are sturdy, functional, honest, without elegance. Their weapons were blunt instruments by any comparison that mattered. Their soldiers were soft-bodied, two-limbed, and needed 8 full hours of unconsciousness per day just to operate. The Vorkai general commanding the campaign put a statement on record that the Conclave had not seen fit to seal. They will arrive, the general said. They will observe. They will request a ceasefire. That is what humans do. The general had studied humans for 4 years. Had read every available report. Was considered, by every military authority in the Conclave, to be correct. 11 human ships entered the Thresh system on the 3rd day of the burning at Colony Thresh 7. 11. The Vorkai had 400 warships in orbit. Vrethka watched from the Karithi command post on the surface. Watched the 11 ships break atmosphere in a clean line. Watched them land in a field 3 kilometers from the burning colony edge. Watched the ramps come down. Jake Mercer stepped off the first transport. He was not remarkable to look at. Medium height. The kind of build that comes from actual work rather than any deliberate effort. He stood at the base of the ramp and looked at the colony, the black smoke rising in 3 separate columns, the sound of something structural giving way in the far residential sector. Then he looked up at the Vorkai fleet hanging in the sky like a ceiling made of metal and intent. He said something to the soldier behind him. Vrethka was too far away to hear it. The soldier laughed. Jake did not. He looked at the fleet one more time. Then he walked toward the burning buildings. His unit followed. Vrethka filed a note in the command record, Human Auxiliary Forces on ground. Monitoring. The Karithi commanders around the post said very little. They were grateful the humans had come. They did not expect it to matter. The first real engagement came on day 4. Vrethka's model of military behavior, built from 11 species and 40 years of study, had a clean and reliable pattern. When a unit takes casualties above 15%, withdrawal probability increases sharply. At 25%, most units begin a managed retreat. At 30%, the engagement is considered broken and regroup protocols begin. Every species Vrethka had ever observed followed some version of this. Not because they were cowards. Because the math made retreat the only rational option, and rational species followed rational options. Jake's unit took 31% casualties on day 4. They pushed forward. Not in a rage. Not in the desperate screaming charge that species sometimes make when they crack under pressure and stop being rational. They pushed forward the way you finish something you started, steadily, without drama, because the alternative was leaving it unfinished. And leaving things unfinished was apparently not something they were willing to do. Vrethka watched this happen. Made another note. This one took longer to write. The Vorkai pulled back from the Thresh 7 colony perimeter on day 6. The paperwork called it a repositioning. Jake's unit secured the colony edge and began pulling survivors out of the structures that were still standing. They worked for 19 hours without stopping. Cole Atkins arrived with the main human fleet on day 9. The Vorkai had expected them on day 3. The 6 days between those two numbers, the 6 days of sensors reading nothing but empty space where a human fleet should have been, were not in any official record. But captured Vorkai commanders, later, in debrief sessions, kept coming back to those 6 days. They mentioned the waiting more than they mentioned the battle. The not knowing. The watching empty space and understanding that something was out there and having no idea where or what it was planning. Cole Atkins' voice came over the fleet-wide channel before the engagement began. Vrethka had the recording. The chamber would hear it. 7 words. No speech about victory. No mention of honor. No version of the things commanders typically say when they are about to commit thousands of lives to a single terrible decision. They have had enough of us. Begin. What followed lasted 31 hours. The Vorkai fleet, 400 ships, the most decorated military force the Vorkai had committed to any engagement in 50 years, pulled back on hour 31. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Not pushed into retreat by a superior force, because by every measurable standard the human fleet was not a superior force. Smaller. Slower to maneuver. Running on technology that was a generation behind in most categories that mattered. The Vorkai pulled back anyway. Vrethka was in the command post when the Vorkai signal came through. The Karithi commanders went quiet for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. One of them said, in Karithi, a phrase that did not translate cleanly but meant something close to, that did not go the way it was supposed to go. Nobody answered. On the ground, in the secured perimeter around Thresh 7 colony, Jake Mercer's unit was eating field rations and arguing about something. Vrethka could hear voices but not words. Someone was laughing. The laugh was loose and easy, the laugh of people who had just been through something and had come out the other side of it and were, somehow, laughing anyway. Vrethka looked at the empty space in orbit where 400 Vorkai warships had been. The Vorkai general had said, they will arrive, they will observe, they will request a ceasefire. The general was not wrong about everything. Humans had arrived. Humans had observed. But the ceasefire request, when it eventually came from the other direction. Vrethka filed that note too. Later, much later, the conclave would receive the official record of the Thresh campaign, processed, formatted, stripped of the parts that were difficult to explain in standard military language. Vrethka had read that record many times. It was accurate. It covered every ship movement, every casualty figure, every territorial outcome with careful and thorough detail. It was also, in every way that mattered, incomplete. Because the official record did not include what Vrethka saw on day 12. It did not include the things that happened in the quiet space after the guns went down and before the paperwork began. It did not include the observations that refused to fit into any available category in any documentation system any species had yet designed. Those were the things Vrethka had spent 12 years figuring out how to say. That was why the hearing existed. That was what came next. The official record of the Thresh campaign was 47 pages long and covered the military engagement in careful, thorough detail. Ship movements. Casualty figures. Territorial outcomes. The kind of document that told you exactly what happened and almost nothing about what it meant. Vrethka had read it many times. Each time, the same thing was missing. Day 12. After the Vorkai pulled back but before the formal ceasefire was filed. The burned colony of Thresh, 3 kilometers of salvaged ruins and smoke that still hadn't fully cleared. A human soldier sitting alone at the edge of what the colony records listed as a primary education facility. The building was gone. The outer walls had held to about chest height and then stopped. The foundation was still there. Jake Mercer was sitting on a section of fallen wall and looking at it. Vrethka had not intended to approach. Was moving through the area for a different reason. But something about the stillness of it stopped that. A human being completely motionless was unusual. Vrethka had learned, over time, to notice it. Jake did not look up when Vrethka got close. 22 kids, he said. Vrethka stopped. I do not understand the reference. In this building. He said it to the Foundation, not to Vrethka. 22 kids were in here when it came down. Vrethka understood then. The building. The children. The number and what it meant. I am sorry, Vrethka said. Jake nodded once. A long moment passed. The smoke drifted. Something in the distance settled with a low, tired sound. We were too slow, he said. Then, after another pause, won't happen again. He said it the way you say a fact about the physical world. The way you say water runs downhill. Not a promise built out of anger or grief. A correction. A recalibration after an error. Something filed and noted and already being acted on. Vrethka stood there for a moment and then walked away. Back at the command post, Vrethka tried to file a note about the exchange. Started it 3 times. Deleted all 3. There was no category in the Karithi military documentation system for what that conversation had been. There was no box to put it in. So it went unfiled and sat in Vrethka's memory instead, where it had stayed for 12 years. The second thing that would not file was this: human grief did not stop humans. Every species Vrethka had studied used grief as a processing state. The organism receives a loss significant enough to trigger it, and then it pauses. It slows. It reroutes internal resources toward the processing of the loss before it can continue. This was consistent across 11 species from direct experience and consistent across xenobiology literature covering most of the rest. The length of the pause varied. The mechanism varied. The pause itself did not. Humans grieved in motion. Nora Callahan, the human diplomat attached to the Karithi support mission, received a notification on day 14. A ship carrying her younger brother had been reported missing in a sector far from Thresh. Vrethka saw the message arrive. Saw Nora read it. Saw the thing that crossed her face, brief and total, like something vast moving under very still water. 4 hours later she was in a diplomatic session. The session ran for 6 hours. She closed a supply agreement and 2 secondary treaties. The Karithi lead diplomat said afterward, without knowing what Nora had received that morning, that she had been the sharpest negotiator in the room. At some point in the middle of those 6 hours, Vrethka passed a supply corridor adjacent to the meeting room. Heard a sound. Stopped. 4 minutes. Then silence. Then the sound of a door. Then footsteps returning to the session. Vrethka stood in the corridor for a moment after the footsteps faded. Did not file a note. Some things refused to be filed. Some things sat in a different part of memory than the rest and stayed there. The third observation came on day 19. The battle for Thresh 7's second moon had ended. The Vorkai had lost more than they expected. The human fleet had lost more than they expected too, but the expected number had apparently not factored into the human planning the way it would have for most species. Cole Atkins walked the field after the engagement was over. Vrethka watched this from a distance, through the viewport of the command ship. He walked from marker to marker. The markers were the simple field kind, not permanent, put up fast. At each one, he stopped. His lips moved. He was not performing this. He did not know he was being observed. There was no protocol in any human military document that required this. Vrethka checked afterward, specifically. The search returned nothing. Vrethka asked Jake about it the following day. Jake looked at the floor for a moment. The particular floor looking that meant he was choosing his words. He talks to them, Jake said. What does he say? Jake thought about it for a while. That he's sorry. That it was worth it. That he's going to make sure it stays worth it. Then Jake went quiet in the way that meant the conversation was over, even though they were both still standing there in the same space. The fourth observation came the night before the final engagement. Vrethka moved through the human encampment at what translated roughly to 3 in the morning, a time when, by all available data, humans should have been in their required rest state. The 8-hour unconsciousness that their biology demanded. They were not unconscious. Small fires. Card games. 2 soldiers in a loud and heated argument about a sports team. Vrethka checked the team's city of origin later. The city had been destroyed in a disaster 7 years prior. The team still had fans. The argument was intense enough that others stopped to listen. One human sat alone at the edge of the firelight with a stringed instrument across his lap. He played it so quietly it was almost not sound at all. The music went nowhere in particular. It didn't build to anything or resolve into anything. It just continued, note after note, in the dark, like someone talking to themselves in a language that didn't have words. Vrethka stood at the edge of the light for a long time. Walked back to the command post. Filed nothing. 12 years later, standing in the conclave chamber with 31 species waiting, Vrethka said. I spent 12 years looking for the right way to explain what I saw in that camp. I have not found it. What I can tell you is this, I have fought beside 11 species. I have studied 31. I have never, not once, seen anything that looked like what I saw that night. The chamber was quiet. A species that carries grief and keeps walking. That corrects its mistakes without drama and means it. That argues about things that no longer exist because the arguing itself is how they hold on to them. A pause. A soldier sitting alone in the dark, playing music that goes nowhere, for no one, because he needs to. Vrethka looked at the human tier. Jake was looking at the floor. Nora was holding her mug. Cole's hand was at his left breast pocket. I did not know, that night, what I was looking at, Vrethka said. I believe I know now. And I believe this chamber needs to know it too. Because you have been making decisions about this species based on what it cannot do. And you have not once asked what it has chosen not to do. Nobody responded. The silence was a different kind than before. Before, the silence had been comfortable, the easy quiet of a chamber that had already decided the answer and was waiting politely for the speaker to finish. This silence was not that. This silence was the sound of 31 species sitting with a question they had not expected to be asked. Vrethka let it sit. That was the point of it, the chamber had been quiet for most of the testimony. That was over now. The Drenethi delegate spoke first. This was predictable. The Drenethi were old, careful thinkers, and they had spent 11,000 years being the voice that took difficult things and turned them into manageable language. They were very good at it. It was, in many ways, their most useful quality. With respect to the honored Vrethka, the delegate said, in tones that were measured and precise, "What we have heard is a personal account. Compelling, certainly. But open to interpretation. What appears to be extraordinary resilience may simply be a product of limited awareness, a species too young in its galactic experience to fully understand the weight of what it is walking into. What looks like grief in motion may simply be an inability to fully process. These are not qualities to fear. They are qualities to study." Nora Callahan put her mug down. She set it on the railing with a small, clean sound. "I would like to ask the delegate," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that reaches every corner of a room without effort, "to explain to this chamber what limited awareness looks like when it is scaled across 12,000 personnel, 3 separate command structures, and a decision that no one gave a direct order for." The Drenethi delegate opened its mouth. "Because on day 4 of the Thresh engagement," Nora continued, "Jake's unit took 31% casualties with no order to advance. No central command pushing them forward. Each soldier made that call independently. I've been listening carefully for the past hour, and I haven't heard a category that fits that. I'm curious which one the delegate would like to use." The Drenethi delegate closed its mouth. Nora picked up her mug. The Vorkai delegate made a formal procedural motion. The testimony, it argued, contained classified military material. The hearing should be suspended pending a review of what could be legally presented to a full conclave session. This was the correct procedural move. The Vorkai were very good at correct procedural moves. They had been using them for centuries to slow down conversations they did not want to have. Cole Adkins stood up. He did not speak. He did not file a countermotion or ask to be recognized or do any of the things that were formally required to participate in a conclave session. He stood up from his chair in the lowest tier, the charming and fragile tier, the one for species that didn't require serious thought, and stood there in his worn uniform with the rectangular outline in the fabric of his left breast pocket where something had been carried for a long time. The chamber looked at him. Looked at the pocket. Sat with whatever math that added up to. The procedural motion failed by 23 votes. Vrethka waited for the chamber to settle. Then presented the piece of evidence that had no military category and no precedent in 6,000 years of conclave records. An audio recording. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Taken on day 22 of the Thresh campaign, in the holding facility where the captured Vorkai general was being processed. The Vorkai general in the recording was decorated across 5 campaigns. A being who had fought wars that Vrethka had only read about in history files. The kind of commander whose name appeared in military scholarship as a fixed point that other things were measured from. A being who had seen, by its own count, everything there was to see in a military engagement. The general asked Jake Mercer one question. "What does your species want from this? You have no territorial claim in Thresh space. No resource need. No political advantage that I have been able to identify. What is the end state? What does victory look like for humanity here?" Jake's answer came after a pause of 4 seconds. "There are friends." Silence on the recording. Then the general's voice, lower than before, with something unreadable in it, "That is not an answer." "Yeah, it is." The recording ended. The chamber sat with that for a moment. Nobody spoke. The Ferethi delegate raised its communication indicator. The Ferethi were the youngest species in the room, 9 years in the conclave, still learning which questions were considered impolite in open session. This particular quality, it turned out, was occasionally useful. "Should we be afraid of them?" the Ferethi delegate asked. The question landed in the middle of the chamber and sat there. Every senior delegate in the room had been carefully not asking it for the past 2 hours. The Ferethi delegate had simply not yet learned which questions you weren't supposed to ask out loud. Vrethka said, "That is the wrong question." The Ferethi delegate waited. "The correct question," Vrethka said, "is this: have you ever given them a reason to stop being kind?" The particular silence that followed was not in any of the 6,000 years of recorded conclave sessions. Because this kind of silence was new. It was the silence of 31 species simultaneously reconsidering something they had already filed away in a category marked finished and not requiring further attention. The Vorkai delegate was looking at the human tier. Jake Mercer was studying the ceiling. Nora Callahan was drinking her coffee. Cole Adkins had sat back down and was touching his pocket. The last piece of evidence was not audio. Not a ship record. Not a battle log or a military document of any kind. It was a simple data file with 2 columns placed side by side. The first column, human casualties from the full Thresh campaign. The second column, the complete reconstruction timeline for every Karithi colony that human soldiers had fought to protect and hold. Below both columns was a supplementary list. 19 names. Human soldiers who, after the campaign ended and the treaties were signed and every other species packed up and went home, had applied for and received Karithi citizenship. Had stayed. Had helped rebuild what they had fought to keep standing. Had, in several cases, still been there now, 12 years later, on a world that was not their world under a sun that was not their sun. 19 names. I am not here, Vrethka said, to warn this chamber about human weapons or human strategy or human military capability. Those records exist and you can read them yourselves. A pause. I am here because 19 soldiers stayed to plant crops in soil they had no personal reason to care about. I watched them do it. I watched them stay when they could have left. And I realized, standing there watching, that we have spent 17 years examining entirely the wrong things. The chamber was still. We measured their ships, Vrethka said. We measured their weapons. We read their diplomatic communications and assessed their biological limitations and filed them in a category that made us comfortable. We never once asked what they were willing to do for the people they decided to call their friends. A long pause. Long enough to be a choice. I am asking you to consider that question now. While you still have the option of asking it calmly. The Vorkai delegate looked away from the human tier and looked at its desk instead. In the lowest tier, Nora set down her mug. She looked at it for a moment, the faded text, the worn ceramic, the mug from a diner in a city she had not been back to in a very long time. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular and waited for whatever the chamber would do next. Jake had stopped looking at the ceiling. He was looking at his hands. Cole touched his pocket one more time and then folded his arms and went still. The conclave had 6,000 years of procedure. 6,000 years of frameworks and categories and classification systems and formal protocols. It had a process for almost everything. It did not, quite yet, have a process for this. The vote failed. Not because the chamber opposed the reclassification. Not because anyone stood up and argued that Vrethka's testimony was inaccurate, or that the evidence was insufficient, or that humanity did not deserve a second and more serious look. The vote failed because, after 6 hours of deliberation behind closed doors, the conclave's classification committee returned with a single finding: there was no existing category to put humans into. They did not fit under military power. The definition required territorial ambition or active resource expansion. Humanity had neither. They did not fit under diplomatic power. The definition required political maneuvering at a scale capable of influencing galactic outcomes. Humanity had barely managed 3 chairs and a ceramic mug in the lowest tier of the chamber. There was no category for a species that crossed the dark between stars to help people who were not their people and then stayed to grow food in someone else's soil. No existing framework for beings who grieved in motion. Who apologized to their dead and meant it. Who argued about sports teams whose home cities were ash because the arguing itself was a way of holding on. The conclave tabled the vote. Agreed to form a committee. The committee would report back within 2 standard years. This was, in galactic political terms, the closest thing to panic the conclave knew how to show. The session closed. 31 delegations filed out through 31 separate corridors, which was how the chamber was designed, each species departing in a different direction so that no one had to walk beside anyone they didn't want to walk beside. It was a very old design feature. It had served the conclave well for most of its 6,000 years. In the corridor outside the main chamber, Vrethka moved toward the transport bay. 7 limbs. Measured steps. The particular kind of quiet that settles over a being after they have said a true thing to a room full of people who were not prepared to hear it. Jake Mercer fell into step alongside. He walked in silence for a moment. The corridor was long and the footsteps of 31 departing delegations made a layered sound in the walls. You didn't have to do that, Jake said. It felt necessary, Vrethka said. We've been doing fine. I know. Another stretch of corridor. The sounds of other species fading into other hallways. Then what was it for? Jake asked. Vrethka considered this. Because you do not see yourselves clearly. And eventually, someone in that chamber was going to make a decision about humanity based on what you are not. Based on the category you were filed in. And it was going to go very badly. Jake thought about that. Badly for us. No. A pause. Badly for everyone else. Jake was quiet for a few steps. Then he nodded, once, in the way that meant he had taken the information in and was done with the conversation. He turned at the next corridor and walked back toward the human transport without looking back. Vrethka watched him go. He moved the same way he always moved, no hurry, no drama, like someone who has somewhere to be and has simply decided to get there. In the transport waiting area, Nora Callahan sat on a low bench with her bag beside her and her mug in her hands. She was turning it slowly, looking at the faded text. A junior aide from the Drenathy delegation approached. Carefully. The way young diplomats approach things they have been told to handle delicately. The cup, the aide said. I noticed it during the session. I wanted to ask, what is it from? A diner, Nora said. In Cleveland. The aide had no reference for this. What is Cleveland? A city on Earth. She kept turning the mug in her hands, slowly. It isn't there anymore. She said it the way you say something true that you have already made your peace with. Flat. Present. Not up for discussion. The aide stood there and did not know what to do with a person who could say that and keep turning the mug without her hands shaking even slightly. Can I ask you something? Nora said. The aide said yes. You want to know the real thing about humans. Not the battles. Not the 19 soldiers. The thing under all of it. The aide said yes again, and this time there was something genuine in it, not diplomatic courtesy, but actual wanting to know. Nora looked at the mug. The letters that had almost completely disappeared. The warmth still in the ceramic even though the coffee inside was long gone. We mourn everything, she said. She put the mug carefully into her bag and stood up. Shouldered the strap. And then we make breakfast. She walked to the transport without looking back at the aide, who stood in the waiting area for a long time after she was gone, trying to figure out what exactly had just happened. In the transport bay itself, Cole Atkins was already seated. He had the photograph out. He looked at it, a real look, not the quick touch he usually gave it, and then slid it back into his left breast pocket and pressed his palm flat against the fabric for a moment. Just a moment. Then he folded his arms and looked at the transport wall and waited. Jake came in and sat across from him. They did not speak. The transport lifted. They flew back to the human ship through the dark between the Conclave station and their fleet in a silence that had things inside it, the kind of silence that builds between two people over years of being in difficult places together, the kind that does not need to be filled and would not benefit from filling. Outside the viewport, the Conclave station shrank slowly behind them. The chamber inside it was empty. Vrethka had stayed. The tiers were dark. The 31 delegation seats were empty. The enormous ceiling disappeared into shadow the way it always did, doing its job of making everything below it feel very small. Vrethka moved through the empty space alone, 7 limbs carrying the particular tiredness that comes not from physical effort but from finally releasing something that has been held for a long time. The lowest tier. 3 empty chairs. The railing. Nora Callahan had left her mug. It sat on the railing exactly where she had set it at the start of the session. The Vorkai delegate had looked at it with half a second of polite dismissal. Every senior species in the chamber had looked past it at some point today and seen only the artifact of a small and charming and largely irrelevant species that did not require serious consideration. Vrethka picked it up. It was still slightly warm. Earth's best. The letters nearly gone. You had to already know what they said. Vrethka stood in the empty chamber and held the mug and thought of Jake Mercer sitting on a burned wall saying 22 kids, the way you state a fact that you are already correcting for. Thought of Nora in a supply corridor for 4 minutes, and then back in a room for 6 hours closing treaties, not one person in the room knowing what she had put down to walk back through that door. Thought of Cole Atkins walking a field after a battle, lips moving at every marker, saying the things no protocol required him to say because he had apparently decided they needed to be said anyway. Thought of 19 names on a community board in a rebuilt colony under a foreign sun. And below the names, in handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, in the uneven script of someone who had never been told penmanship mattered. Still here. Vrethka set the mug back down. Exactly where Nora had left it. Nobody had feared humans. That was always going to be the problem. Not because humans were secretly monstrous, they were not. They were something harder than monstrous to account for. They were a species that felt everything, carried it, and kept moving anyway. That buried its dead with apologies and came back the next morning. That crossed the cold dark between stars for people who were not their people and then stayed to plant things in the wreckage. That played quiet music in the dark the night before the worst day and argued about things that did not exist anymore because the argument itself meant those things were not entirely gone. The universe had spent 17 years looking at humans and seeing a charming biological footnote. It had not looked closely enough. Vrethka stood in the empty chamber for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the galaxy, in a rebuilt colony on a world that had burned and been put back together by 19 people who had no reason to stay and stayed anyway, it was morning. Humans were making breakfast.